Welcome to the latest episode of the Resilient CISO. I'm your host, Harold Rivas, the CISO at Absolute Security. And today I'm joined and thrilled to have you on board, Mike Wilkes, the CISO at Aikido Security. I'd love to start with an introduction. Mike, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? I think you've done some really cool stuff with NYU, with Columbia University. Tell us a little about yourself.
Yeah, thanks. Looking forward to talking with you. And I love the title Resilient CISO because I think that's a great place to focus our efforts in improving our trade craft. For myself, I like to give my first assertion of identity as being an adjunct professor of cybersecurity at NYU. I've been teaching for the last 5 or so years in the fall, teaching classes to graduate students and to cyber fellows, returning adult students. So at this stage of my career, it's about giving back and to bringing more CISOs into the world and having that as a legacy rather than garnering logos for myself. Although I have had some good ones. I used to be the CISO at Marvel Entertainment, where I like to joke it was my job to keep Iron Man safe, which is a pretty fun tagline. And if you saw Infinity War or Endgame, you know what happened after I left. I wasn't there to protect Iron Man anymore.
Of course.
Most recently, I was the first CISO for Major League Soccer, and that was fascinating. Learning a lot about the OT that's involved in stadiums, and infrastructure. And plus, my son got to go see Lionel Messi play at Yankee Stadium when NYCFC played Inter Miami. So that was a bucket list item for him. But I teach at Columbia. Started teaching there this spring, IT risk management. And I've been involved with the World Economic Forum for about 5 years now, and working on white papers and case studies for oil and gas industry, cyber resilience, best practices. And most recently, I was invited to join the Quantum Security Working Group, which is a pretty sexy topic. If you think about it, it's probably the Reese's Peanut Butter Cup of hype cycles coming our way when you combine, quantum and machine learning. And those two are just going to blow everything out of the water, I think. But a couple other things. I worked in DevOps for many years as an infrastructure person, so I'm a very hands-on CISO. And I, for example, gave birth to Starbucks back in 1998, working in San Francisco during the dot-com bubble, and Macy's.com as their first e-commerce platform, Blockbuster. If Blockbuster only knew that Be Kind Rewind was not the future, they might still be relevant. So I've had the fortune of working in lots of different industries and careers. I've done some financial services, and I see that you've had a lot of experience in that area as well. I ran the Chicago Mercantile Enterprise server platform with about 10,000 servers and $2 quadrillion in contracts traded. So that was what we call a CFI, if you know, right? Significantly important financial institution. But happy to chat with you about resilience. I studied philosophy in college, so pardon me if I quote Heraclitus or something at you every now and then. So.
This is going to be such a fun chat. Thank you so much for joining me, Mike. I think that our goal today is going to really focus on unpacking the concept of cyber resilience a bit. You walk the trade floor, you go to any major event, you're going to see cyber resilience plastered everywhere. Right? It's a concept that I think CISOs are confronted by. Certainly, there's a lot of marketing messaging around it, but fundamentally, we've all been at this for quite a while, right? I think we have some gray to show the years we've spent in this endeavor. And cyber resilience as a concept is one that's kind of intriguing. There's concepts and philosophies on the periphery, things like anti-fragility, which I know we're both a fan of, but let's think a little bit about how we might define it, right? Like as an operator in this industry, how do you look to define the concept of cyber resilience?
Well, some of my own thinking on this was informed by Kelly Shortridge, who's a great thinky thinker, as you might call it. She wrote something called The Red Pill of Resilience in Information Security, and it's a great talk, and you can also read the posting on it. And she talked about how the willow bends and the oak, the fable, right, of how the oak fell over, right? And we want to have resilient infrastructure. We want to have resilient, processes in place. And I think there's at least two major different definitions that we could approach. One of them is like a mechanical kind of engineering that has to do with like ductile and tensile strength, and maybe hammering out, the fender on a dent on a Volkswagen Beetle. But I don't think that's really a useful definition of resilience. We don't want to just return to the former state prior to the incident or to the dent. And we want to be transformed. We want to be adaptive, and we want to be robust in our ability to withstand extreme forces. And so I think that's closer to the sort of psychological and ecological definition of resilience, where you don't return to the former state, but you become better. And that's why I think, Nicholas Taleb's anti-fragile is a good analogy for us to think about. If we assume breach and assume compromise, then we really need to embrace failure in order to stand back up, right? Resilience would be a measure of how quickly you can stand back up and with confidence after that breach happens, after that security incident happens, even if it's not your own fault, right? It could be a third party that caused the breach, and that's a big deal these days.
Yeah, Mike, I'm reminded of experiences that I've had, organizations that have had, an occasional issue, a failing, a breach, or any significant negative event, and how that organization reacted to the situation, how they handled the communications around it, how they brought the business back stronger, more engaged with its customers. It actually was an indicator not only of how thoughtful they were, right? They faced an issue, but fundamentally, they bounced back stronger and better than they ever were before. I have been absolutely stunned to find an event in my experience where I'm overseeing maybe a third-party organization that my organization depends upon, and finding that their approach to the issue made them a more important vendor to me, one where I may not even have known who they were before. So it absolutely is an opportunity for an organization to bounce back stronger. Let's talk about that a little bit. So as an organization embracing some of these concepts, what does that look like? How might you implement some of these in the boardroom conversation? I think it's a real challenging conversation to have as a CISO, to say, we're making these major investments. We all know we want to try to prevent all these things. What happens when all of that fails? What do we do then? It's a difficult conversation to have because, in my experience, I know that many CISOs only get a few minutes of airtime with their boards on a quarterly basis, let's say. Some may be on a monthly basis. But, at the end of the day, how do you take these concepts and translate them into something that is more approachable, let's say in a boardroom setting?
Well, one of the things that came up when I was the CISO at Security Scorecard, we were in the business of running Nmap and scanning all of IPv4 and finding, vulnerabilities, and then doing attribution scans to figure out who owns that particular risk, right, and that particular asset or IP address. And so originally, I think some of the marketing and some of the descriptions was about breach likelihood, and saying a company with an A is like 70% less likely to be breached, or maybe a company with a C or a D is 70% more likely to be breached than a company with an A. But that doesn't mean you won't be breached. Everyone will be breached. I think that's the mantra, right? It's a matter of when and not if. And I've evolved that thinking a little bit further towards thinking about a concept of breach cadence, and to think about risk appetite and residual risk, right? We can't eliminate risk. That's impossible. The fourth quartile of risk mitigation is just so expensive, and the diminishing returns on that investment, right? Millions and millions of dollars for really small edge cases. But if we think about breach cadence, you can imagine FireEye, Mandiant, having a really strong security culture, good resources, good budgeting, and a good dose of paranoia about being attacked. And you can then imagine they have maybe a 5-year breach cadence. It took APT29, Cozy Bear, some serious infectation of, the build servers for SolarWinds, right, to get into FireEye and to take over and use that infrastructure, to bypass their Kerberos, MFA, and mint, new golden tickets. And so I think if you think about some of the other companies, their security culture, their resource allocation, their risk appetite is maybe higher. And so they have maybe a 2 to 3 month breach cadence at T-Mobile, it seems, right? These are just the ones that we read about, I'm sure there's other incidents happening that they don't disclose. And so I think that's one way to potentially explain it to board members, and to put it in their own language is talking about risk management more than about CVSS scores and CVEs, because that's too much in the weeds for a lot of the boards. I often think about it in terms of talking to my parents. How do I explain something, to my parents? And so you need to use metaphors and analogies to sort of say, what's the risk here we're dealing with, like heart bleed, for example, or some of the other vulnerabilities. And coming up with a good analogy and a metaphor is a powerful way of explaining things without actually having to explain things to them. And that's one of those sort of Jedi mind tricks, where they think, oh, it was their idea to fund, this identity and access management improvement. Right?
That's fantastic. And I think, when I think about the NIST framework and the mechanisms they've provided to anticipate, withstand, recover, and adapt, fundamentally, that framework is forcing us to start to think about this not as a prevent and react, right? Because many organizations still are very much we're making all this major investment to try and prevent the bad thing from ever happening. And if the bad thing happens, we're going to make sure we react quickly to withstand and adapt. Okay, what does that look like? How do we withstand a campaign against us? Well, we might harden our systems. We might, make sure every vulnerability, we might start looking at things like, posture management and other considerations, right? Other program evolutions. But this recovering the business quickly, is one of these key concepts that I think makes resilience such an important conversation to have, because many organizations have underdone the recover focus. I mean, we all carry out BCP, we all carry out all these campaigns to try to make sure that the business can come back to life. I'm really curious, Mike, your thoughts, because if we look at this and say, okay, all things being equal, pretty much every single business is going to have some cyber dependence, some technology dependence. The availability of its technology systems is critical to the operations of that business. And CISOs are going to be right in the middle of that. The conversation, the evolution of this role to be one where we are absolutely critical to the ongoing viability of the business, absolutely critical to how the entirety of the mechanisms that run that business continue to operate, and therefore how they recover. I'm curious, looking out 5 years hence, the CISO role continues to evolve, and we're having more and more direct oversight around the things that keep the business running. What do you think? How do you think about this concept of business resilience? Not just cyber resilience, but that evolution, because cyber resilience feels like a very narrow focus on a much bigger problem. Curious about your thoughts.
Yeah, I think one of the ways to look at it is with the military concept of left of boom and right of boom, right? Boom is when the shit hits the fan, something goes wrong. And I actually have previously called out, I like to blame Benjamin Franklin for coming up with a 1765 or something, meme. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And I think we've codified this into our frameworks. And I think it was Dragos and their OT blog post that I read a while back that talked about how they measured how many controls are prevention focused. And I think of there being a prevention bias, actually. And that's one of the reasons why I think we need to pay more attention, mind share, and budget on right of boom, because that recovery element and that ability to stand up with confidence is really what's lacking, especially if you think about architecting for something like an Amazon outage, right, which happened in October. And a lot of folks thinking, how would I mitigate that? And then, as if we didn't need another example, Cloudflare, right? They had their outage. And I was suggesting that, you should have more than one CDN, right? And when I worked at Marvel, we were building out Disney Plus, and we had lots of them, right? We had Limelight, and we had Akamai, and you need to have fault tolerant providers for your third parties to mitigate some of those risks. And if you don't want to mitigate it, then you should document it, and the business takes that decision. One of the things that I think will evolve is for us to be better at, like I said, unpacking some of that prevention bias, and to actually work with honeypots, right, and to allow intruders to sort of stay on the network and not just try to eradicate or eject them immediately, and to learn the tactics, techniques, and procedures, and learn where they're trying to pivot and go next, and to entertain the possibility of understanding the threat actors with deception technology and networks. I think that's one of the areas that we can evolve. And then, of course, we need to get better at speaking the terms and language of the business. As a profession, I think CISOs have 3 conversations at any given point in their career, and they need to know which one they're having at any given moment. So there's a technical discussion that you're having with developers and with people that do understand the CVEs and the CVSS scores and patching and stuff. And then you have peer discussions that are strategic with VP of engineering, with this chief technology officer, with the head of legal. And then you have this third conversation, which we're not terribly good at as a whole, which is sort of the executive or governance discussion with boards and with regulators. And there you can't, retreat to your comfort zone. You have to really speak a very different kind of language. And to be able to do that, I think that's where the evolution of our role is headed, is to be better at speaking in terms of business alignment and business objectives. In this case, I think one of the ways to describe that is you're familiar with the concept of security awareness training, where we send the rest of the business off to training and say, don't use short, easy, guessable passwords. Don't reuse passwords. Don't make it your dog's name plus your birth date, that kind of thing. And I think somebody at a boutique conference here in New York a while back had a nice turn of phrase on that. He said we need to have business awareness training for CISOs and for InfoSec people, and to help them learn how to use security as a strategic enabler, and how to make it a differentiator for your business in the competition of doing whatever it is that your company does.
That's awesome, Mike. I have a shorthand for that. It's remarkable. I always find it so curious how through experience, through years, you end up at the same insights. I have 3 as well. I call it the operator. That is that business persona, the revenues, the expenses, the SG&A for the company. I call it the architect, that deeply technical conversation that needs to happen. And I call it the connector, the concept of that influencer, storyteller. How do I bring an organization together and tell the right message? So it's always remarkable how common these insights emerge over years of experience. Mike, I think that's it for us today. I am so thrilled to have you on. I look forward to maybe getting together again and having a double click, a deeper conversation on concepts like anti-fragility, which I think really need to be unpacked and explored. Thank you again for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thanks. Happy to chat with you again sometime.